Now I would like to introduce to you Mark Sleboda. He's originally from Pennsylvania, and he currently lives in Moscow. He was with the U.S. military. His focus is anti-American hegemony, but he's worn many hats. He's a contributing political analyst for Russia Today. He's a former lecturer and researcher at the sociological faculty for Moscow State University. He was a former nuclear reactor operator for the U.S. Navy, and he studied international relations theory at London School of Economics and Social Science. This is his third appearance with Unity 4J Vigil, and please go back and look in the archives of his two prior speaking events here with us. He has really a lot to say. He's a fascinating person, and I'm very much looking forward to this interview. So, Mark, welcome to your third appearance with Unity 4J, and we'd just like to know about some of the recent events. Can you bring our audience up to date? They don't have their fingers on the pulse as much as you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. It's an honor and a pleasure, and it is, of course, a big honor to be included among such an incredible assemblage of figures from the right, from the left, from around the world, who have all found common cause in the case of WikiLeaks, and particularly of Julian Assange under siege as a political prisoner in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. There have been some events in recent days that are probably a cause for a great deal of concern with Julian Assange in the immediate future. Just over a week ago, the editor-in-chief of RT, Margarita Semenyan, tweeted out that she has sources that indicate that Assange is about to be evicted from the Ecuadorian embassy by the new Ecuadorian government of Lenin Moreno, having struck a deal with the United States and the United Kingdom. And that this would occur within days or weeks. Glenn Greenwald, of course, the famous journalist now with The Intercept out of Brazil, several days later confirmed that with several of his own sources that are well informed within these governments. On top of that, we've got some recent news, particularly about relations between the new government of Ecuador and the United States, which do not bode well for Julian's fate. They have apparently struck a deal to open a U.S. military base once again in Ecuador. This will not be called a U.S. military base, of course. The Ecuadorian constitution bans permanent foreign military personnel on Ecuadorian soil. This will be known as a security cooperation office. And how Moreno even himself explained that they would simply get around the constitutional ban by having U.S. military troops rotating constantly in and out of the embassy. One would finish a tour, another group would come in, and then they would leave in another group, and then they would cycle through, and you would quickly see some of the same faces again. But this would maintain a permanent U.S. military presence, and this is actually very similar to what the United States is doing in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, and in Poland, with a military force that is in violation of the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty. And they, again, use this claim of rotating forces, that they don't have permanently stationed forces. Well, of course, forces are permanently stationed there, the fact that if some faces change every month or so and are quickly replaced by others with a rotating lineup, it is a poor, really poor, lame excuse for what is an obvious violation of these treaties and the Ecuadorian constitution in this question, not just in spirit, but in actuality.
Mark, I have a question. Could this Security Cooperation Office, might we compare it in past history to Vietnam, where we sent in advisors and then that was the easy parlay then into actual troops? But is this sort of perceived as back in the day the Vietnam advisors?
Yeah, well, I mean that of course was an actual conflict situation at the time. This is a little bit different in that Ecuador previously had a president who was adamantly opposed to a U.S. military presence in Ecuador, and we have to note that the U.S. has over 1,000 foreign military bases scattered around the world, in some 140 up to 150 out of 192 countries. This is how empire works. A lot of people who aren't familiar with the history of empire and hegemony, this is how the British Empire actually started and functioned for much of its existence, with the creation of military bases, supposedly for security reasons and securing global trade routes around the world. This is exactly what the British Empire did in its early stages. And the U.S. doesn't need to directly run foreign governments in the modern day. Simply the permanent presence of U.S. military forces able to exert pressure not only on that government in question, but then to be used militarily against surrounding states. We saw this, of course, with Iraq. We've seen it with Syria. How countries that have U.S. military bases are used to surround and contain countries that do not align themselves with U.S. foreign policy interests.
Mark, just for the record for our audiences today, could you please document how many foreign bases, military bases, Russia has around the world compared to the United States is over 1,000?
Yeah. The U.S. has the highest number of foreign military bases. This is followed by the United Kingdom and France. Russia comes in a quite distant fourth, with 11 foreign military bases, 2 of which are currently in Syria, and all of the others which are in former Soviet countries that Russia has longstanding deals with since 1991. So not anywhere near the global presence. China has 1 foreign military base at the moment. So they've got a while to go before they're able to present any challenge on that score from U.S. hegemony.
This is a little bit of a side, but why do you think they established that base in Djibouti, of all places?
Because for China, it is very important because that is an extremely important trade route. China's economy depends on importing resources, manufacturing consumer goods, right? Cheap consumer goods. So today they aren't actually that cheap. They're quite into high-tech consumer goods at this point, and then shipping them to the United States and other companies around the world. But they need a constant flow of goods. China is actually a country more dependent, and which is today a bigger guarantor of the existing global trading order than any other country, because their domestic stability, their economy depends on it. Import resources and export goods. And Djibouti has access over a very important trade routes coming out of Africa. And Africa is a very important source of lots of different kinds of natural resources, for the Chinese economy.
Thank you. If we could get back to Ecuador now, um, would it be going too far to say that what the U.S. probably did in order to indirectly get at Julian Assange, could we say that Morena was a soft coup?
Um, There is a lot of talk, a lot of evidence. We've heard this from the former President Correa and others about the role that the U.S. has had meddling in Ecuadorian politics to make sure that the person who replaced Correa was much more amenable to U.S. interests. We know through research from actually U.S. academic research from Carnegie Mellon and elsewhere that the United States is the country that has meddled in other countries' political affairs, and we're talking elections and other normal political affairs, more than any other country in the world by a very large scale. Up until just 2000, between 1945 and 2000, the U.S. meddled directly in other countries' elections and political affairs 81 times. And that is not counting military interventions and covert regime change operations. This is just political meddling.
So if we have coups, outright coups, and soft coups, so an outright coup would be Chile or Iran, and then soft coups, what would meddling be if you put it on a continuum with coups? Because surely we can come up with a neologism here for a quasi-soft coup. I would love to see a word for that instead of just meddling, oh, who knows what they did. But it's a form of coup. Put it on the coup continuum. What do you think about that?
It comes in very close behind that, because often it's just instigating, funding, and supporting domestic coups that then fulfill U.S. military interests. And there's a word for it in the part of the world that I'm in, of what they call this, having had a great deal of experience with it. They call it color revolutions.
Yes. Thank you. Exactly. Right.
Yeah,
We're seeing quite a proliferation.
We've seen this all over Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, but we've seen it as far abroad as, of course, Serbia and Lebanon, which underwent what was something known as a cedar revolution to help bring a U.S. aligned government into power. And this is, it all rather ironic considering current U.S. claims that their poor, innocent, pristine, shining city on a hill democratic system has undergone meddling because of some Facebook memes and some exposure via emails that one of their own political parties was rigging their primary elections in order to guarantee at least one of the two candidates in the final election. That if the U.S. was doing that to another country, which they have many times, they might call that democratization. And you might view whoever did, through WikiLeaks, bring to light those Clinton emails exposing the collusion between the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, to rig the Democratic Party primary against Bernie Sanders and in favor of Hillary Clinton. That you might call that some much needed democratization given to the United States people. So WikiLeaks, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, as we see with all this political meddling, wherever it is on the coup continuum, there is, of course, the whole economic realm. The CIA is just the shock troops, basically, for economic meddling and outright intervention. Could you please speak about any deals or what happened economically with Ecuador to twist their arm?
Yeah. Of course, Ecuador has faced a lot of economic repercussions particularly during the administration of Rafael Correa, for joining basically the Bolivarian Axis resistance to U.S. a long history of U.S. imperialism in South and Latin Central America. But this was brought even further to a head, of course, when Rafael Correa dared to grant Julian Assange political asylum in the embassy in the United Kingdom. In recent days, with the election of Lenin Moreno, evidently some pretty sweet deals have been cut between Ecuador and the United States, because in just the past few weeks, Ecuador has exported a record amount of oil to the United States. And there is, I think, good reason for a lot of speculation that some type of deal has been cut, and that this is one of the methods of rewarding Morena for what we can only presume will be, and Morena has said that Assange must eventually leave the embassy, and that he wants him gone. We just haven't gotten a final date yet. On top of that, there's the question of IMF loans. And IMF loans come, of course, with a lot of political conditionality attached to them. A couple of decades ago, we were well aware of this situation as the Washington Consensus, whereas neoliberal shock therapy and political structures were changed to privatize off the resources of the countries that were getting these loans, usually into Western company hands. And the political structures in these countries were rearranged such that the political elites were more aligned with U.S. foreign policy interests. And this, of course, will almost certainly be forced on Ecuador as well if they accept IMF loans, and they are badly in need of capital at the moment. Their economy has been ailing, a lot of it under U.S. blackmail with economic measures as well. There is talk that the U.S. has blocked an IMF loan up till now. The recent trip by the U.S. Vice President Pence to Ecuador is seen as helping smooth this out, and that Ecuador may indeed in very soon time take a IMF loan, which will be approved and have its conditionality set out by the United States. And I do not think that will be a good deal for the Ecuadorian people, unfortunately.
Well, there seems to be a whole repressive wave in South America happening again. Of course, we all remember the Brazilian dictatorship, the Pinochet. All of South America and Central America, of course, was brutal totalitarian governments and dictatorships. And then
supported by the United States.
Completely, 100%.
By the United States, yes.
And then it became such a wonderful, especially after Allende, that sad time, people finally were able to, throughout South America, become more progressive. We saw Evo in Bolivia, Brazil. Oh gosh, I can't remember the
Lula and Dilma Rousseff.
Yes, of course, a wave of it. But now we're seeing like a backlash.
Yes.
Argentina, Chile, Brazil with the coups that happened there, and of course Venezuela is directly in the crosshairs. So Ecuador, within the context of this backlash back to U.S.-controlled dictatorships, is they barely have, from the OAS, any kind of solidarity for this now as it moves into more repressive era. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, we've definitely seen a very quiet rollback, and the U.S. has not been as heavy in this regard. We haven't seen overt military coups supported by the U.S., but there's no question of the many links, particularly between Tremor in Brazil and the constitutional legislative coup, as they called this, to remove Dilma Rousseff from office under what are obviously spurious charges, and to imprison Lula da Silva to make sure that he can't run again and replace the government. And you know, this flies in the face. You know, the current Brazilian president is U.S. aligned neoliberal. And not only was he not elected, but his approval ratings are absolutely rock bottom in the country. But you know, to be fair, no politicians in Brazil have very high approval ratings, but he has just about the worst that they could possibly be. And Brazil, you know, being by most standards the most important country in South America, it's simply, you know, because of their size, their population, their economic heft, their membership in BRICS, and so on, was very important. But you know, we've seen multiple coup attempts to attempt to bring Venezuela back in line, and obvious connections, financial, political, and otherwise, there between opposition figures in Venezuela and the U.S. government. You know, and we've seen rollbacks in Argentina and Uruguay and other countries. So the Bolivarian Revolution is almost over, unfortunately.
Exactly. So that does not bode well for someone like Julian Assange. Not if, but when he has a country to go to seek asylum. Russia is actually looking, with Snowden there and Susie Dawson and just so much Putin's measured reaction to all of the threats that we have been imposing against them. Russia's looking almost like a shining light. So South America is sort of not looking very positive. Where would Julian go when he goes to seek asylum in a country?
Yeah, well, Russia's not a leftist country. It must be said. Russia has its own interests, and you know, they sometimes align and sometimes do not. But you know, that's neither here nor there. With the granting asylum to Edward Snowden and the question there, you know, Russia is not a country that supports, you know, shall we say, information utopia, you know, the absolute freedom of information. Myself, I'm a realist and a statist. I don't support the absolute freedom of information, and I myself don't believe in privacy anymore on the internet. I think that has flown the coop a long time ago, and we're living in a post-privacy world. And I do believe there are certain times that certain states do need to take security measures. But obviously, you know, the U.S. with the Five Eyes global spying cabal, its attempts to enforce hegemony, both surveillance, militarily, economically, culturally, around the world, goes way, way overboard. And I think Assange himself saw this a long time ago and focused a lot of his attention on the U.S. because of the power imbalance in the world, in an attempt to perhaps not just change the behavior of the U.S. hegemony state through the release of whistleblowers' information from inside the government, but to prevent that hegemony from working effectively, and which is what he's talked about in a lot of his writings. What other countries is it possible for Assange to go to? Unfortunately, there's not a very long list. I know that Julian once probably looked at Germany as as one of the best, but you know, Germany has long since proved that it has very limited sovereignty on foreign policy measures when it comes to the United States. We saw that quite clearly when it was exposed that Barack Obama's government was tapping right into Angela Merkel's mobile phone, and the quite muted response for that quite heinous, I would say, spying on the leader of a country that is ostensibly, of course, a firm U.S. ally. You might even say client state. But the muted reaction out of Germany towards that shows, I think that Germany doesn't have quite the foreign policy independence or the sovereignty to stand against the U.S. there. Unfortunately, most of the countries that do, of course, have their own security and national interests and security structures, and may not make themselves, we're thinking of Russia, China, Iran, not a good ideological match for Julian Assange, even if he is forced to make accommodations on pragmatic grounds.
If you were in Julian's shoes, what would be your top 3 countries that you would be trying to get asylum in?
Well, they would have to be countries that can stand up to pressure, economic, covert, and otherwise, from the United States. And there's very few countries in the world that can do that or are willing to. India might be one such country that could, but is not probably willing to. Unfortunately, again, as I said there, the top 3 contenders are Russia, China, and Iran, with a demonstrated, ability to resist both pressure and advances by the United States within their regional parts of the world. The U.S. is still by far the world's hyperpower, the only superpower to a hyper degree. They are definitely the first among others, even as we see a multipolar world starting to be dawned. The nearest countries around, in the power scale that are opposed, to the U.S., at least U.S.-led hegemony, if not the United States itself. China, Russia, and Iran are regional powers. The days of the Soviet Union are long gone. We're not living in a bipolar world anymore. We're living in the transition phase from a unipolar to a multipolar world. But Russia is not a superpower, and they will never be again, more than likely. They are a great power and a regional power. China is definitely a great power, and they have it certainly economically within the realms of becoming a superpower, but they're several decades away from building the military that would be needed even to challenge the United States, which has basically decamped itself in the South China Sea and Taiwan right in their backyard, on the opposite side of globe from the United States. So, I mean, Russia, China, Iran, these are the countries you're looking at that have both the ability and the will. And none of those would, again, be an exact ideological match for Assange if he was to make such decisions purely on ideological rather than, say, geopolitical or pragmatic grounds.
Right. So those would definitely, of course, trump the ideology. Just out of curiosity, what prompted you choosing Russia to go to as opposed to anywhere else in the world?
Well, these things are never made for one reason, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself. But I have some Russian ancestry. I'm a 100% Slavic mutt with ancestors who immigrated to the United States from Russia, from Slovakia, and possibly elsewhere in Eastern Europe. So there is a certain call to blood. My wife, whom I met in the United States, is from the Crimea. So she's Russian. And that had a big part in it. But I also really appreciate Russian culture, society, and politics. We talked about countries that have both the ability and the will to resist U.S. hegemony. Right now, that is certainly number one in step is Russia. And I'm not a liberal. I'm maybe a post-leftist, a post-Marxist, but maybe not like they usually are conceived in the West. And Russian politics and society actually appeals to me, especially being an international affairs and security analyst, especially the foreign policy. And that's what I appreciate the most.
Okay. Getting back to Julian's current plight, this handover that Ecuador is very close to doing with the British government, how do you think that's going to play out? What do you see the progression of steps being taken and the likelihood of him eventually being sent to the U.S.? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, just in the past month, we've had word that there was a British double agent working in the Ecuadorian embassy. She was evidently a member of the Ecuadorian intelligence agency, working in the Ecuadorian embassy under diplomatic cover, as is common with many states. I would say almost all states. They always have some intelligence agencies working under diplomatic cover. And she was working as a double agent for the British government in both, the embassy and in the intelligence work, and in particular, her duties in the most recent time was spying on Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. Well, she has since, in recent days, defected to the United Kingdom, and that might be an indication, that again the time is rapidly coming up. Now there are some potential, I don't want to say roadblocks, but there are some potential speed bumps in Ecuador simply kicking Julian Assange onto the British street, which we presume he will then be extradited to the United States. One is that Rafael Correa granted Julian Assange Ecuadorian citizenship. And the Ecuador and the United Kingdom do not have an extradition treaty that allows Ecuador to simply hand over one of their own citizens to the British government. So it will be necessary to take the rather extraordinary measure of revoking or rescinding Julian Assange's Ecuadorian citizenship in order to kick him out of the embassy. Once he's outside of the embassy, he will be immediately picked up. The British have stopped the open siege, but they always have intelligence and police personnel in the immediate vicinity watching the embassy. And of course, this will all be arranged beforehand. He will be picked up, and he faces charges of jumping bail on the withdrawn Swedish request to interview him on potential charges of rape. He was never actually charged by Sweden. That have since been dropped. But the United Kingdom has made clear that they intend to pursue the charges of him jumping bail by accepting political asylum within the Ecuadorian embassy. Now, of course, the United Nations committees itself have condemned the United Kingdom for this. The United Kingdom is in breach of the Vienna Conventions. Ecuador, having granted Julian Assange political asylum, should have had the right to then evacuate him from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom putting Assange in the embassy under siege never allowed that to happen. United Nations committees on governing people human rights situations have declared that the United Kingdom must release Julian Assange, and because the conditions that he's living in amount to torture, and he has the diplomatic right under the Vienna Conventions to leave, which they never allowed him to do. The United Kingdom simply ignored the United Nations and international law, as Western countries so often do when it goes against their own interests. So he would be picked up by British police intelligence, and there would be this rigmarole of him going through a trial with a potentially up to a year sentence for him having jumped bail despite having political asylum on charges that no longer exist. Then there's the question, of course, of would he be extradited to the United States? Numerous U.S. officials have come forward in the recent months and basically admitted that the United States does have secret grand jury indictments against Julian Assange, where they intend to try him under some fantastic reading of the Espionage Act and prosecute him as a journalist for publishing the work of whistleblowers, which of course threatens, the journalistic profession, certainly the integrity of it, and all those other newspapers that shared not only work with WikiLeaks like the New York Times, the Guardian, and so on, but any newspaper that has ever published whistleblowers exposing crimes and misdeeds of government. There's the question of whether the British courts would resist extraditing Assange to the United Kingdom. And I know Glenn Greenwald has some hope on this score, that while the United Kingdom government is a quite subservient client state to the United States, that there still exists some independence in the judicial branch. I'm not quite sure about this. I think that there will be evoked some kind of status on Julian Assange as an actual belligerent, as a military threat, and this will be quickly swept through the British courts. I hope I'm wrong on that score, but once he's in the United States, if it comes to that, then he will quickly face a grand jury and will definitely be imprisoned for a very lengthy time by what is frankly a U.S. prison state.
Do you think they'd send him to Guantanamo?
No, I don't think that they would send him to Guantanamo. Simply one, because of the already quite bad public relations situation with that, and the type of detainees that the U.S. still has there. But the U.S. does have very quietly a number of high security facilities where they keep what are essentially political dissidents, some of them of Islamist extremists, some of them animal rights, people who have committed crimes in the name of environmentalism or animal rights. These are basically containment units for people who have committed political crimes. And I think that is where we would probably see Julian Assange end up in a facility like that.
Right, they're called CMUs.
Yeah, CMUs.
Communication Management Units at maximum security prisons like Florence, and it's like a prison within a prison. We've seen a lot of Muslims there, and of course the animal rights activists.
That would be my guess. That would be my guess.
Yeah, that would make the most sense because they set it up that way for a while. Well, what do you think of the possibility of them trotting out one of their tools, which is the crazed lone gunman playbook that they have in their toolkit? On the one hand, they wouldn't want a martyr, but maybe they'd see the bigger problem is a growing anti-oligarchical, anti-fascist movement through the personage of Julian Assange as the #1 world political prisoner.
Yeah, well, we all, of course, hope it doesn't go to that far, but we have heard numerous U.S. political leaders and call for the assassination of Julian Assange. So in recent days, we've even seen BBC journalists call for the murder of Julian Assange. And it's not like the United States doesn't do these things. Usually, it has, in at least in recent years, focused on those of a potentially more violent and jihadist threat. But there's no question, under President Obama, the U.S. actually had a assassination czar and a kill list with a disposition matrix to continually churn up names to the top of the list, through which, through their fleet of flying murder machines, drones, the U.S. extrajudicially and extraterritorially assassinated thousands around the world, including on at least 2 occasions U.S. citizens without any judicial overview. So if they felt the need, you should feel, no sense of idea that they wouldn't do that. I think that for their purposes, that might be a step too far. And the idea of some lone gunman would perhaps be a little transparent, considering the overuse of that historically. But Julian Assange does have a lot of potential to be a martyr figure, rightly so. Not just for the resistance to the U.S. and the journalistic cause, but to whistleblowers. And they have to weigh the repercussions of will more whistleblowers come forward to WikiLeaks and other similar organizations if Julian Assange is not punished, or if they have to take the extreme measure of ending his life prematurely. That will be a call that they will make at that time.
Well, Julian has shown tremendous backbone in the face of such persecution. But facing something like a maxi prison, like Florence, where other political prisoners are, we have so many Muslims in prison right now. The Holy City Foundation 5, what happened to them was just, it needs to be extremely well publicized. It is practically equal to what's happened to Julian Assange, actually, in terms of being able to do just not activism really, but just humanitarian support. But in any event, do you think, in spite of the extreme backbone that he has shown, that if faced with prison and knowingly, he did have the option of just don't go on the internet anymore, just stop being an activist? Do you think he might go that route just to save his life?
Well, he of course has already been without the internet for months now, have no access to the internet or communications of any kind with anyone. So he's already weathering that. He has weathered it, and he is weathering it right now. Julian Assange is I think very much a ideologue, like I think many of us on the Unity 4J are. We put our political beliefs and principle ahead of self-interest. And Julian Assange has certainly done that so far, and I don't see that he would back down from that under such situations.
And especially now, seeing so much support, so many people are coming out for him. Yes, all the more so. Well, we have about 1 more minute. Are there any final comments that you'd like to make, Mark?
Yeah, I think, Julian Assange, one of the most important things they've done is with the U.S. State Department cable releases, and that attracted a great deal of ire from the U.S. And Julian Assange recently, there's a book, The WikiLeaks Files, The World According to the U.S. Empire, which has an introduction from Julian Assange and chapters from a great deal of experts in the fields around the world. And what it is a forensic analysis of State Department cables as the communications of empire, understanding an empire best as we have done historically, whether it's through Babylon or Egypt, through their communications, especially communications, these secret, these classified communications, which were not intended for public consumption, have not gone through the propaganda filter of what they call public diplomacy. I think one of the most important of these cables was a cable between Clinton's office and Podesta that discussed, it was a step process of defeating ISIS. And within that cable, very specifically, it was noted that the Saudi Arabian and Qatari governments, which are U.S. allies who receive hundreds of billions of dollars of arms sales from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and others, the open admission there that ISIS and Qatar are arming and funding ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other Islamist extremist groups around the world, in Africa and elsewhere, Boko Haram, for instance. And this is despite the fact that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were part of the U.S. supposed anti-ISIS coalition in Syria. Now, this should have groundbreaking repercussions because it completely destroys the U.S. justification for being there, exposes the heinous, immorality of their relationship with the Saudi regime, and that their de facto backing of ISIS and other terrorist groups in Syria and elsewhere. You sell arms to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia gives arms to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I mean, what kind of a racket is that? And then you use the excuse of the formation of ISIS and Al-Qaeda then to launch military operations, regime change against Syria. This should have received a huge amount of attention from the world press. The fact that it didn't is a condemnation of the Western journalist community, I think, because it would completely blow up U.S. foreign policy, their role in Syria and in other countries in the region. It's I think the most unhighlighted work of that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have released from the files they have gotten from whistleblowers.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Mark Sleboda, you have been very informative, very astute analyst. We so appreciate having you here and look forward to hearing you again, but ideally we won't have to hear you again. But if we do, you would be an excellent return guest speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you.